All right, so get ready, because today we're gonna totally rethink how we see the world.
Yeah, sounds intense.
It is. We're diving deep into strategic competition.
So not just war versus peace.
Nope, way more nuanced than that. We're talking about the constant, subtle power struggles happening all around us all the time.
That sounds sneaky.
It is. And our guide for all this, the U.S. Marine Corps Doctrinal Publication 1 for 4, Competing.
Okay, military stuff. So, like, a war manual?
Kind of, but it goes way deeper. It's more like a playbook for how nations and other actors, maneuver for advantage, all the time, not just during war.
So it's like they're saying competition never really stops.
That's exactly it. It's this constant back and forth, this game of power that's always going on, even when things seem peaceful.
I'm intrigued. So how do they break this down?
Well, they start with this concept they call the competition continuum.
Okay, continuum, like a spectrum.
Yeah, they actually use a couple of models to illustrate it. One is this linear spectrum, peace on one end, total war on the other.
Okay, makes sense. Makes me think of those threat level charts you see in movies sometimes,
Yeah.
like green, yellow, orange, red.
Right, exactly. But here's the thing. Most interactions between countries and stuff, they don't fall neatly on either end. They're somewhere in between.
So like a lot of gray areas.
Tons of them. And the document makes this really interesting point. Even actions that seem cooperative, like trade deals or humanitarian aid, they can have these hidden competitive undercurrents.
So even when countries are being all friendly and helpful, there's still this element of trying to get one up on each other.
Precisely. It's like that saying, keep your friends close and your enemies closer. You're always looking out for your own interests, even when you're working with others.
That's kind of Machiavellian, isn't it? Makes you look at the world a little differently.
It totally does. Makes you start questioning everyone's motives. Is this country really helping us, or are they just trying to gain leverage?
It makes you think of the Marshall Plan after World War II.
Yeah, good example.
On the surface, it was all about the U.S. being generous, rebuilding Europe, right?
The good guys.
Right. But they were also being super clever. By helping Europe get back on its feet, they were preventing the spread of communism.
Oh, yeah, stopping the Soviets.
Exactly. And at the same time, they were boosting their own influence in the region. It was a win-win for them, really.
Totally a power move.
Yeah, smart too.
So the Marshall Plan, on the surface, it looks like pure cooperation. But if you view it through this competition lens, it becomes something else entirely.
It's like a chess game, almost.
Yeah.
Every move has multiple layers of meaning.
Exactly. And speaking of chess, they have this other model for the competition continuum, a circular one.
Circular. Interesting.
Yeah, so instead of just a straight line, it's this loop, this cycle.
Like how things can escalate.
Yep, it shows how competition can escalate towards conflict, but also de-escalate back towards a more stable state. Through things like deterrence or negotiations.
Okay, so it's not just a one-way street toward war.
Not necessarily. But here's where it gets even more interesting. The document argues that war itself, even though it's super violent, it actually sets the stage for future competition. It's like resetting the board for another round of the game.
So it's like even after you win a war, the competition doesn't just end.
Nope. Think about it. After World War II, Japan was completely defeated. But then, over time, what happened?
Well, they rebuilt, obviously.
Exactly. And they became an economic powerhouse, a major competitor to the U.S., despite losing the war.
That's a good point.
So it's this constant cycle, this ebb and flow of power and influence. Even total victory in war doesn't end the competition, just changes the playing field.
And probably makes the competition even more intense, like everyone's trying to prove themselves.
Right. Now, the document digs into some of the key characteristics of this competition, things that make it so challenging, so unpredictable.
Like what?
Stuff like ambiguity, uncertainty, kind of like how war can be super foggy and confusing sometimes.
Yeah, I get that. In war, it's not always clear who's winning, who's losing, what their goals even are sometimes.
Right. And that same fogginess exists in this broader competition. It can be super hard to figure out a rival's true intentions. Their motives might be mixed. Their actions could be misinterpreted.
So it's like you're playing poker with someone who's wearing a mask. You can't read their tells.
Exactly. Think about the U.S. and al-Qaeda back in the 1990s. It wasn't even clear for a while that they were locked in this competitive struggle. let alone what Al-Qaeda's endgame was.
Yeah, that was a weird time. It felt like everyone was trying to figure out what was going on.
Right, and that uncertainty, that ambiguity, it makes it so much harder to respond effectively because you're not even sure what you're dealing with or who you're dealing with.
Makes it really tough to plan, too. Like, if you don't know your opponent's goals, how do you know what moves to make?
And the document talks about how rivals exploit this uncertainty using tactics like gradualism.
Gradualism sounds harmless enough.
Yeah. Sounds it, but it's not. It's basically this idea of like salami slicing.
Like cutting off little pieces at a time.
Exactly. They make these small moves, these incremental steps that on their own don't seem that threatening. But over time, they add up.
Death by 1,000 cuts, basically.
And because each individual action seems minor, it can be super hard to counter. Like, how do you justify a huge response to something that, on the surface, seems insignificant?
Yeah, it's like, do you overreact and look like the aggressor, or do you underreact and let them keep chipping away at you?
It's a real dilemma, and rivals know that. They use it to their advantage.
Smart but sneaky.
Yeah, and then there's this other tactic they highlight, boundary stretching. This one's a bit more in your face.
Boundary stretching, so pushing the limits.
That's it. It's when countries or groups, they deliberately push the limits of what's considered acceptable behavior.
Almost like they're testing the waters.
Yeah, they're testing the red lines, seeing how much they can get away with without triggering a major response.
Oh, like Russia with Georgia and Ukraine?
Textbook examples, they exploited the ambiguity of the situation, kind of played the victim card while they were actively pushing those boundaries for their own gain.
Yeah, that caused a whole lot of chaos and confusion.
And that's partly the point. To create chaos, to sow confusion, to make it harder for their rivals to respond effectively.
So this whole competition thing, it's pretty messy, huh?
Yeah, and the document is very clear about that. It says all the ambiguity, the uncertainty, the boundary pushing, it's all happening within this system that's constantly in flux.
And in flux, meaning?
Meaning it's always changing, always evolving. The document emphasizes fluidity, disorder, even complexity as like core attributes of competition.
So in other words, it's a mess. And you got to be comfortable with that mess.
Exactly. You can't go in trying to oversimplify things or expecting everything to be neat and tidy, because it's not.
Embrace the chaos, as they say.
And there's another element they bring up that I found super interesting, the human dimension of all this.
Human dimension. Okay, now I'm curious. What's that all about?
Well, it's about how even the threat of violence, even if there's no actual fighting, it can totally mess with people's heads.
Oh yeah, psychological warfare.
Kind of, but it's bigger than that. It's like the mere possibility of things escalating, of things getting violent, it creates this whole atmosphere of fear and uncertainty. And that impacts decision-making, can lead to miscalculations. It's all part of the game.
So it's like even the unspoken threat, the potential for things to go bad, it's a weapon in itself.
Exactly. And it makes you realize how, like, every action, even seemingly insignificant ones, can have these ripple effects in this whole competition thing. Every statement a leader makes, every troop movement, every tweet, it all sends a message and contributes to this larger dynamic.
It's a lot of pressure. Like you're always being watched, always being judged. Every move you make could be interpreted as a sign of weakness or aggression.
It is. And that brings us to this kind of cool idea the document talks about, the interplay of art and science in competition.
Art and science, those seem like total opposites.
Right. But they argue you need both to be successful in this environment.
So like, how does that work?
Well, the art part, it's about like being creative, envisioning new ways to achieve your goals, coming up with innovative strategies, thinking outside the box.
Okay, so that's like the brainstorming, the big picture vision stuff.
Exactly. But then you also need the science side, the analytical skills, the systematic planning, the ability to assess risks and opportunities, adapt your approach based on what's happening.
So it's about having a good plan, but also being flexible enough to change it on the fly.
That's it. You got to be able to think on your feet, react to unexpected situations, improvise a little bit.
Makes sense. Because in this kind of environment, things are constantly shifting, right? You can't just stick to a rigid plan.
Yeah.
You got to be able to adapt.
Exactly. And the document emphasizes how this whole competition thing, it's constantly evolving too. It's like an arms race, but not just with weapons.
So it's about more than just having the biggest guns or the fastest tanks.
Way more. It's about ideas, about strategies, about narratives, all of that evolving and adapting in response to each other.
Like a constant game of one-upmanship?
That's a good way to put it. They use the example of like power projection versus A2AD, anti-accessory denial.
Okay, breakdown time. What's A2AD?
It's basically a strategy to keep your opponent from being able to project their power into your backyard.
So like building up defenses to keep them out?
Yeah, like denying them access to certain areas, making it too risky or too costly for them to operate there.
Okay, I'm following.
So for a long time, the U.S. was all about power projection, being able to send troops and stuff anywhere in the world. But then rivals like China, they started developing A2AD strategies to counter that. Now the U.S. has to adapt, come up with new ways to project power or find different ways to achieve their goals. It's this constant back and forth.
Makes you realize how important it is to stay ahead of the curve, to constantly be innovating and adapting your strategies.
Absolutely. It's like a never-ending chess match where each side is trying to outmaneuver the other, anticipate their next move, and stay one step ahead. And speaking of maneuvering, the document dives into some pretty heavy theories of competition. They get into how different countries conceptualize and approach this whole struggle, like their overall game plan.
So like how different players see the game, how they think about winning.
Exactly. It's like getting inside their heads, trying to understand their motivations, their goals, their strategies. It's all about figuring out how they tick.
Sounds like some serious mind games.
It is, and it starts with understanding their national policy, like their overall game plan for how they want to compete on the world stage.
So that's their long-term vision, their grand strategy.
Exactly. It's about identifying their enduring national interests, the things that are most important to them, and then figuring out how to achieve those interests through competition.
But those interests can change over time, right? Like as the world changes, as new threats emerge.
Of course. That's why they emphasize how current policies need to adapt to specific situations. It's about finding that balance between sticking to your long-term goals and being flexible enough to adjust to new realities.
So it's not just about having a plan. It's about being able to execute that plan in a constantly changing environment. Adapt or die, as they say.
Exactly. And then there's the question of how you translate those interests, that national policy, into actual competitive advantage. Like, what are the tools you use to gain an edge?
Yeah, how do you go from wanting something to actually getting it?
That's where things like economic strength, military power, even cultural influence come into play. These are the tools countries can use to exert their influence, to shape events, to achieve their objectives.
So it's about having a strong economy, a powerful military, and a culture that people admire and want to emulate.
Those are definitely big factors. The U.S., for example, has historically had a huge advantage in innovation, technology, science, all that. But now other countries, like China, they're catching up, challenging that advantage.
Right, so you got to keep innovating, keep pushing the boundaries, or you risk falling behind.
Absolutely. And the document points to Israel as a prime example of a country that's really good at leveraging its strengths, even though it's relatively small. They highlight Operation Outside the Box, where Israel used cyber warfare to basically take out a Syrian nuclear facility.
Oh, wow. That's pretty impressive.
It was. It showed how they developed this advantage in a very specific domain, cyber warfare, and they were willing to use it to protect their interests.
Like a small country, but they punch above their weight because they've got this unique capability.
Exactly. And it shows how competition is evolving, how new domains like cyber are becoming increasingly important. It's not just about tanks and planes anymore.
It's like the battlefield is expanding, becoming more complex and more unpredictable.
And that's where things get really tricky. Another point the document stresses is that competitors are complex systems.
Complex systems meaning?
Meaning they're not these like monolithic entities. You can't just assume that every country acts as one unified force.
Oh, right. They're made up of people, right, with
Right.
different ideas, different motivations.
Exactly. And they have internal factions, different political groups, different power centers, all vying for influence. Their decision-making processes can be super opaque, hard to understand from the outside.
So it's not just about figuring out what a country wants. It's about figuring out who within that country is calling the shots. And those power dynamics can change too, right?
All the time. The document uses Iran as an example. You've got the supreme leader, the president, the IRGC, all those different power centers. Their interactions are super intricate, not always predictable.
So even if you think you understand a country's goals, there could be all these internal factors that throw a wrench in the works. You might be negotiating with one person, but someone else behind the scenes could be pulling the strings.
Exactly. And it makes the whole competition thing so much more complex and unpredictable. You really have to have your finger on the pulse of what's happening inside these countries, understand the internal dynamics to have any chance of predicting how they'll behave.
Sounds like you need a whole team of experts just to keep up. political scientists, economists, historians, psychologists.
You do. And that's just to understand one competitor. Multiply that by all the different players on the world stage, and you can see how quickly things can get complicated.
It's a lot to wrap your head around.
Yeah.
But I'm guessing the document doesn't just stop at describing the problem, right? They offer some solutions, some strategies for dealing with all this.
They do. They get into the actual tools of competition, the methods countries use to try and gain an advantage in this global struggle. And it's not just about military stuff. They break it down into a few key categories, starting with attraction.
Attraction. Sounds more like dating advice than international relations.
Right. But it's actually a pretty clever strategy. It's about making yourself seem appealing to other countries, being the kind of country that others want to partner with, want to align with.
So it's about building a good reputation, being seen as a reliable ally.
That's part of it. But it's also about strategically using incentives and rewards to influence other actors. Things like offering trade deals, providing economic aid, or even just fostering cultural exchanges. All those can be tools of attraction.
So it's like, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. You make yourself useful, and others will want to be on your good side.
Exactly. And it doesn't have to be all about, material benefits. It can also be about shared values, shared interests. The U.S. training program for Japanese amphibious forces is a good example.
How so?
Well, it strengthens the alliance between the two countries. It helps Japan build up its own military capabilities. And it sends a message to China that the U.S. is committed to the region, that they're willing to back up their allies. All of that contributes to shifting the balance of power in the region, even without firing a shot.
It's a subtle but powerful way to exert influence. Makes you realize how every action, even something like a training program, can be part of this larger competition.
Right. And the document also looks back at historical examples of attraction, like the Huk Rebellion in the Philippines.
The Huk Rebellion, wasn't that a communist insurgency?
It was. And the U.S. was super worried about communism spreading in Southeast Asia, so they used this multifaceted approach to help the Philippines fight back. They provided military aid, yeah, but they also provided economic support to help the country develop and address some of the underlying grievances that were fueling the insurgency. And they also focused on building strong personal relationships with Filipino leaders, cultivating trust and understanding.
So they made themselves the more attractive partner, so to speak.
Yeah.
Like, hey, we're not just here to boss you around. We genuinely want to help you succeed.
Exactly. And it worked. The Philippines ultimately rejected communism and became a key U.S. ally in the region.
Smart move. Shows how attraction can be a really effective long-term strategy.
It can. But, of course, there's also the flip side to attraction. Coercion.
The stick to go with the carrot. I figured they'd get to that eventually. You can't always be the nice guy in international relations, can you?
Nope. Sometimes you got to play hardball. And that's where tools like compellence and deterrence come in.
Okay, so what's the difference between those two?
Compellence is about forcing someone to do something they don't want to do, while deterrence is about preventing them from doing something they're thinking about doing.
So compellence is like, do this or else, and deterrence is more like, don't even think about doing that or you'll regret it.
That's a good way to put it. And both rely on the implied threat of force. The idea that if you don't play ball, there will be consequences.
It's like you're showing your teeth, letting them know you're serious, even if you're not actually biting.
Exactly. But the consequences don't always have to be like a full-blown war. It could be economic sanctions, diplomatic isolation, all sorts of things. The document uses the Suez Crisis as an example.
The Suez Crisis, wasn't that back in the 50s?
Yeah, in 1956, Egypt had nationalized the Suez Canal, which was super important for global shipping and stuff. Britain, France, and Israel, they weren't happy about that, so they invaded Egypt.
Bold move.
It was, but it didn't go well for them. The U.S., under President Eisenhower, they were furious. They didn't want this whole thing to escalate into a bigger conflict, especially with the Soviets lurking in the background.
Makes sense.
So what did Eisenhower do? He used economic threats, basically told those countries that if they didn't withdraw from Egypt, there would be serious financial consequences.
So he hit them where it hurt, their wallets.
Exactly, and it worked. They backed down, withdrew their troops, and the crisis was averted, no shots fired, but the threat of force, in this case economic force, was definitely there.
It's fascinating how sometimes it's not about who has the bigger army, but who's willing to play their hand more effectively. Like that example with Iceland and the UK.
Oh yeah, the Cod Wars. That one's a classic.
It's like David and Goliath, but with fishing boats instead of slingshots.
Totally. So the Cod Wars, they were this series of disputes between the UK and Iceland over fishing rights in the North Atlantic. The UK had this big, powerful navy, but Iceland was super determined to protect its fishing grounds.
Because their economy basically depended on it, right?
Exactly. It was a matter of survival for them. So they play hardball, they use their Coast Guard vessels to harass British fishing boats, cut their nets, even rammed them sometimes.
Wow, they weren't messing around.
Nope. And the crazy thing is, Iceland won.
They did. How did they pull that off?
Well, they leveraged their stronger national interest. They were willing to go further to take more risks because it was literally a matter of life or death for their economy. The UK, on the other hand, their interest in those fishing grounds wasn't as strong. They weren't willing to escalate things to the point of, like, actual naval warfare over some fish.
So Iceland basically called their bluff. They knew the UK wouldn't risk a major conflict over something that wasn't that important to them.
That's it. They played the game smartly, and it paid off. Shows how even a small country can stand up to a much larger opponent if they have the willpower and the strategic smarts.
It's inspiring, in a way. Shows that it's not always about brute force, but about leverage, about playing your cards right.
Absolutely. And that brings us to what might be the most powerful tool of competition: information.
Information.
Okay.
Now I'm really curious. How can information be a weapon?
Well, think about it. In today's world, information is everything. It shapes perceptions, influences public opinion, even drives decision-making at the highest levels.
Yeah, like propaganda, fake news, all that stuff.
That's part of it, but it's much broader than that. It's about controlling the narrative, shaping the story that people believe about what's happening in the world. And whoever controls the narrative, they control a lot of power.
Makes sense. If you can convince people that you're the good guy, that your opponent is the bad guy, then you've already won half the battle.
Exactly. And the document highlights how the Marine Corps itself, they've been super successful at crafting a very specific narrative about themselves. They're seen as this elite force, the first to fight, tough, disciplined, ready to go at a moment's notice.
In that reputation, that image, it matters a lot, right? It deters potential adversaries, it reassures allies, it influences how people perceive them on the world stage.
All of that. It's not just about having military capability, it's about projecting that capability, shaping how others perceive it. It's all part of the game.
It's like a brand almost. They've carefully cultivated this brand, this image, and it's a powerful asset in itself.
It is. And the document emphasizes how cultural awareness is super important in all of this. What works in one part of the world might totally backfire in another. You got to know your audience, tailor your message accordingly.
So it's not just about shouting your message from the rooftops. It's about understanding how that message will be received by different cultures, different audiences. It's about nuance and subtlety.
Exactly. And it makes you realize how even the smallest interactions, like a public statement from a diplomat or a social media post from a military unit, those can all be part of this larger information game. It's about sending the right signals, shaping perceptions, influencing the narrative.
It's a lot of responsibility. Like you're always on stage, in a way. Every action, every word, it matters.
It does. And that leads us to another point the document stresses: the threshold of violence. This is where things get a bit more precarious.
Threshold of violence. Okay, I'm intrigued. What does that mean exactly?
Well, it's about understanding how the threat of force or even limited acts of violence can be used as tools within this broader competition. It's like, where do you draw the line between peaceful competition and actual conflict? And how do you operate in that gray zone without things spiraling out of control?
So it's like walking a tightrope. You're trying to exert pressure to send a message, but you don't want to accidentally tip things over into a full-blown war.
Exactly. And rivals often try to blur those lines, create ambiguity, make it harder for their opponents to figure out what their intentions are.
So like a game of chicken almost. They're pushing things right up to the edge, seeing who blinks first.
It can feel that way.
Yeah.
And the document points out how the Marine Corps often operates right on that edge. They're prepared to deter aggression, to compel others to do what we want, or to respond with force if necessary.
So they're like the tip of the spear, always ready to go, always on the front lines of this competition.
In a lot of ways, yeah. Think about, the deployment of Marine Expeditionary Units, or MEUs. They're these, mini task forces that can be sent anywhere in the world at a moment's notice.
Yeah, I've heard of those. They're like a Swiss Army knife of military capability.
Exactly. They can do a little bit of everything. They can respond to humanitarian crises. They can conduct peacekeeping operations. They can engage in combat operations. And that flexibility, that ability to operate across the entire spectrum of conflict, that's what makes them so valuable in this era of competition.
So they're not just about fighting wars, they're about preventing wars,
Yeah.
about shaping the environment, about being present and ready to respond to whatever challenges arise.
That's it. They're like the ultimate tool for this whole competition thing. They can be the good cop, the bad cop, whatever the situation demands. But it's all about supporting the larger national strategy, navigating that complex continuum we talked about earlier.
It's a lot of responsibility,
Mhm.
and it requires a certain mindset, certain understanding of the bigger picture.
It does. And speaking of strategy, the document goes deep on the whole idea of decision-making, initiative, and response. It's like a master class in thinking like a strategic competitor.
Okay, so what are the key takeaways there? What do they emphasize?
Well, one big point is the importance of gaining the initiative. It's about forcing your rival to react to what you're doing rather than the other way around. It's about setting the pace, controlling the tempo of the competition.
Yeah, makes sense. If you're always reacting, you're always one step behind.
Exactly. And it's about shaping events to your advantage. But here's the challenge. We've already talked about how ambiguity is baked into this whole system. Rivals use it to slow down responses, create confusion, and make it harder to even figure out who's responsible for certain actions.
Right, so even if you want to take the initiative, it can be hard to know who to target, who to respond to. It's like if you swing at a ghost, you're just going to hit air.
It can feel that way. And that's why the document highlights how difficult it can be to attribute actions, to figure out who's actually behind a particular event. Cyber attacks are a perfect example.
Yeah, it can be almost impossible to trace a cyber attack back to its source. And even if you can, how do you prove it? How do you hold them accountable?
It's a huge challenge, and rivals know that. They exploit that ambiguity, that uncertainty, to their advantage. It makes it much harder to deter them because they can just deny involvement, say it wasn't them, and there's often no way to prove otherwise.
So it's like fighting a shadow war. You're not even sure who you're up against, let alone how to defeat them.
It can feel that way, but the document does offer some potential countermeasures. It talks about how defensive cyber operations can be used to, name and shame attackers.
Name and shame. So basically call them out publicly.
Yeah. It's about exposing their activities, attributing the attack to them, even if you can't necessarily prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. The idea is to counter that ambiguity, to make it harder for them to hide, and to impose a reputational cost for their actions.
So it's like even if you can't punish them directly, you can still damage their reputation, make them look bad on the world stage, and that can have real consequences, right?
Absolutely. It can make it harder for them to make deals with other countries, to attract investment, to build their influence. It's all part of this larger game of competition.
It's fascinating how it all ties together, how everything from cyber attacks to public statements to military deployments, it all contributes to this larger struggle for power and influence.
And it's not just about what we do, it's about understanding how our rivals think about competition, especially authoritarian regimes like China and Russia. Their mindset is often totally different from the typical Western perspective.
Okay, so let's get into that. What makes their approach so different? What are they thinking that we might be missing? One of the biggest differences is they don't really see this clear separation between peace and war.
Wait, so they're kind of always at war?
In a way, yeah.
Yeah.
It's all part of the same struggle for them, like a constant push and pull for dominance.
So even when things seem chill, like during diplomacy or trade deals, they're still scheming.
That's the idea. The document highlights how they often have these really strong central command structures, which makes them super efficient.
Oh, yeah, like they can make decisions and act way faster than we can.
Right. They don't have to mess around with all those democratic processes and debates that can slow us down sometimes.
Yeah, it's a trade-off. We're slower, but hopefully more thoughtful and deliberate in our actions.
True. And they're masters at controlling the narrative, both at home and globally.
Oh, yeah, propaganda is definitely their thing.
It goes beyond that, though. They're good at using cultural diplomacy and all sorts of soft power tactics to sway opinions and push their agenda.
So it's like a charm offensive. Make everyone love your culture, and they'll be more open to your ideas.
Something like that. They're also really good at weaponizing seemingly normal stuff.
Like what? Turning pandas into spies?
Not quite, but think trade, tourism, even cultural exchanges.
How can you weaponize that?
They can use it to create dependencies,
Mm.
make other countries reliant on them economically or politically. Then they can use that leverage to get what they want.
So it's like, be our friend, or else.
Yeah, not so subtle sometimes. The document uses the example of Chinese tourism in Palau. Remember that?
Vaguely. Refresh me.
It's this tiny island nation, Super beautiful. China just flooded it with tourists.
Okay, so instant economic boom for Palau, I guess.
Exactly. But then Palau didn't want to play ball politically with China. So what happened? China suddenly cut off the tourist tap.
Ouch, that's gotta hurt.
Yeah, instant economic crisis for Palau. China basically cowed them who was in control.
That's cold-blooded, but effective, I guess.
It shows how serious they are about this competition. Everything's on the table for them.
And they don't play by the same rules we do, right? The document mentions some pretty shady stuff they're willing to do.
Right. Intelligence ops, election meddling. They'll even cozy up to criminal groups or terrorists if it serves their purpose.
Yeah, not exactly the Marquis of Queensberry rules.
They're ruthless and patient. They can play the long game, think decades ahead.
But they can also be super opportunistic. Like if we're distracted with some other crisis, bam, they'll make their move.
That's why the document uses this phrase, gradualism and sudden seizing. They can move slowly, methodically, then suddenly grab what they want when the opportunity arises.
So it's like they're always testing, always probing, always looking for an opening.
Exactly. And it's hard to counter because you never know when or where they'll strike next.
So you've got China slowly expanding in the South China Sea, taking little bits at a time.
Yeah, like they're playing a game of Go, encircling their opponents slowly but surely.
And then you could have Russia suddenly deciding to exploit some unrest in the Baltics, grab a chunk of territory before NATO can even react.
That's the scary part. They're unpredictable, but also very strategic.
Man, it's a lot to worry about. It's like they've got us playing whack-a-mole on a global scale.
It's definitely a challenge. But the document doesn't just throw up its hands and say, we're doomed. It offers some solutions. It talks about how we can adapt our own approach to this competition and use our strengths to counter theirs.
Okay, I'm all ears. What's the secret sauce?
Well, first off, they say we got to apply some of our own strengths, like maneuver warfare.
Right. Outsmart them, outmaneuver them, be more agile and adaptable.
Exactly. We can't get bogged down in old ways of thinking. We got to be quicker, more creative, and more flexible.
So it's like playing chess against a computer. You can't beat them with brute force. You got to outthink them.
Right. The document also talks about this concept of orienting on the competitor.
Orienting on the competitor, what does that mean?
It means really getting inside their heads, understanding how they think, how they make decisions, what their weaknesses are.
So it's like being a profiler, but for entire countries.
Pretty much. We got to study their history, their culture, their ideology, even their psychology. We can't just focus on their military capabilities. We got to understand the whole picture.
So we need more than just soldiers. We need anthropologists, historians, psychologists.
Exactly. We need a whole new breed of experts who can help us understand these rivals and anticipate their moves.
Makes sense. You got to know your enemy, right?
And the document emphasizes this idea of shaping the action.
Shaping the action, like being proactive.
Yeah. We can't just react to what our rivals are doing. We got to be proactive, setting the stage, creating favorable conditions for achieving our own goals.
So we got to be thinking 10 steps ahead, anticipating their moves, and setting traps, so to speak.
Exactly. It's like playing chess, but on a global scale.
That's a pretty cool way to think about it.
Yeah.
But how do you do that when your opponent is constantly trying to do the same thing to you? It's like everyone's trying to outsmart everyone else.
That's what makes it so challenging, so exciting. And the document actually suggests some pretty interesting tactics for doing this. One that stood out to me was the idea of using deception and decoys.
Oh, like a head fake in basketball.
Exactly. Think about using dummy units to distract your opponent while you make your real move, or leaking false information to mislead their intelligence agencies. Deception can take many forms, and it can be a super powerful tool in this competition.
It's like playing mind games, messing with their heads, keeping them guessing.
Exactly. It adds a whole other dimension to this strategic competition, makes it a lot more interesting and a lot more challenging.
And the document also talks about the importance of combined arms.
Combined arms, you mean like using all the different branches of the military together?
It's more than that. It's about integrating all the tools at our disposal: diplomacy, information ops, economic leverage, military power, and working closely with allies and partners to create a unified front.
So it's about using everything in your arsenal, coordinating all your efforts to create a more powerful, more effective response.
Exactly. It's like a symphony orchestra, where all the different instruments are playing in harmony to create a beautiful piece of music.
Nice analogy. And it's not just about brute force. It's about being smart, being strategic, using all the tools at your disposal to achieve your goals.
And the document stresses how important it is to have a clear long-term strategy. They call it campaigns of competition.
So it's not just about winning individual battles, it's about winning the whole war.
That's it. It's about thinking beyond the immediate crisis, about the big picture, the long game. And it's about recognizing that this competition, it's going to be going on for a long time.
So we got to pace ourselves, be in it for the long haul. No quick fixes, no easy victories.
Exactly. And it's about being adaptable, being able to adjust your strategy as the situation changes, as your opponent adapts. It's a constant back and forth, a never-ending game of chess on the world stage.
And it's a game we can't afford to lose.
No kidding. The stakes are incredibly high. But the document doesn't just leave us feeling all doom and gloom. It offers tools, strategies, ideas for competing effectively in this complex environment.
Yeah, it's like a pep talk, a call to action.
Yeah.
Saying, hey, this is a tough challenge, but we can do this. We just got to be smart, be strategic, and be willing to fight for what we believe in.
So what are some of the key takeaways here? How do we level the playing field, so to speak?
Well, I think one of the biggest takeaways is that we need to start thinking differently about competition itself. It's not just about winning wars, it's about winning the peace and everything in between.
Winning the peace, that's an interesting way to put it. So it's about more than just military might. It's about diplomacy, economics, cultural influence, all those things working together.
Exactly. It's about using all the tools at our disposal to create a more stable, more prosperous world that aligns with our values and interests. And it requires a whole new skill set, a new mindset, a willingness to embrace complexity and ambiguity.
So it's not about trying to simplify things to make them black and white, but about embracing the gray areas, the uncertainties. That's where the real action is.
That's where the real opportunities are. And I think that's where the Marine Corps can really shine. They're adaptable, they're innovative, they're used to operating in those gray zones where the lines are blurred, where the stakes are high.
So this document, even though it focuses on the Marine Corps, it really has broader implications for how we think about national security and global affairs.
Totally. It's a wake-up call, a reminder that the world is constantly evolving, and we need to be evolving with it.
Right, like we can't just rest on our laurels, assume that things will always be the way they are. We got to be thinking ahead, anticipating the next challenge, the next threat.
And one of the most important things to remember is that competition is not just something that happens out there between nations. It's happening all around us, all the time, in every aspect of our lives.
You're right. We see it in the business world, in politics, even in our personal lives. We're constantly competing for resources, for attention, for influence.
Exactly. And understanding these principles, recognizing the patterns, it can give you an advantage in any field, in any interaction.
So this deep dive isn't just for Marines or national security experts. It's for anyone who wants to understand how the world really works, how power dynamics play out, and how to navigate this complex and ever-shifting landscape.
It's about developing a strategic mindset, a way of thinking that can be applied to any situation.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into strategic competition, what's the one thing you want our listeners to walk away with?
I think it's this. The world's a complex and challenging place, but it's also full of opportunity.
Yeah. Don't let the challenges scare you off.
Exactly. Embrace the complexity, the uncertainty, the competition. By understanding the nature of competition, by being adaptable and innovative, we can not only survive, but thrive in this ever-evolving environment.
That's a great message. It's not about being intimidated by the challenges, but about being empowered to meet them head-on, find creative solutions, and ultimately shape the world we want to live in.
And the Marine Corps, with its focus on professional development and adaptability, they're in a great position to lead the way in this new era of competition.
Well said. So, listener, as you go about your day, think about all the ways competition's shaping the world around you. From the business world to the political arena to your own personal life, it's everywhere.
And remember, every action you take, every decision you make, it can have an impact on this larger game. Be strategic, be adaptable, and never stop learning.
And maybe most importantly, don't be afraid to compete. Embrace the challenge, find your edge, and use your strengths to make the world a better place.
It's kind of wild, right? This whole document is about the Marine Corps, but it feels like it has lessons for everyone. Like, it's not just about military strategy, it's about life strategy.
So, totally. That's what I was thinking too. It's like this whole idea of strategic competition, it's everywhere. Everywhere. Yeah, it's not just like countries fighting each other. It's businesses battling it out. It's politicians trying to win elections. Heck, it's even like us trying to get that promotion at work.
Exactly. Even just getting a table at a crowded restaurant on a Saturday night.
Yeah.
You know, it's all competition, just on different scales.
So how can our listeners who might not be, generals or diplomats actually use these ideas? Like, what can they take away from this?
Well, I think the most important thing is to start seeing the world through this lens of strategic competition. Like, just be aware that it's happening all around you, all the time.
So, like, pay attention to the power dynamics at play, even in seemingly ordinary situations.
Exactly. And don't just react to stuff, try to anticipate what's going to happen. Try to shape this situation to your advantage.
Be proactive. Like, don't just let life happen to you. Make life happen.
Yep, that's it. And don't be afraid to think outside the box. Be creative. Find new solutions to problems.
Like the Marines do. They're always coming up with new tactics, new ways to fight, new ways to win.
Exactly. And that adaptability, that creativity, those are skills that anyone can benefit from, no matter what field they're in.
It's all about having that strategic mindset and being willing to learn, to adapt, to change with the times.
Because the one thing that's for sure is that this world of strategic competition, it's not going to slow down anytime soon. It's only going to get more complex, more challenging, and more unpredictable.
So we got to be ready for it. Embrace the chaos, as they say.
Yeah. The document makes this really important point. Like, it's not just about knowing all the answers. It's about knowing how to find the answers, how to figure things out on the fly.
So it's not just about what you know, but about how you think.
Exactly. And that's what makes this whole conversation so relevant, even for people who aren't like directly involved in national security. It gives you this framework for thinking about competition, a set of tools that you can apply to any situation where there's, a struggle for advantage.
Like, it's a mental toolkit for navigating the modern world. A way to understand how people and organizations are going to behave, even when it seems totally random or chaotic.
And that understanding can be really empowering. It helps you make better decisions, anticipate problems, and position yourself to succeed, even in a world that feels super crazy and unpredictable sometimes.
All right, so as we wrap up this deep dive into strategic competition, what's the one big takeaway you want to leave our listeners with?
I'd say this: embrace the challenge. The world's a competitive place, but it's also a place full of opportunities, especially for those who are willing to step up, and play the game.
Don't be a spectator. Get in there and compete.
Yeah, exactly. Don't be intimidated by the complexity, the uncertainty, any of that. Develop your skills, hone your thinking, figure out what your edge is, and use it to your advantage. You might surprise yourself with what you can accomplish.
Well said. It's not about avoiding competition. It's about understanding it, learning how to play the game, and using that knowledge to achieve your goals. So, listeners, as you go about your day, think about all the different ways competition is shaping the world around you, from big global stuff to your own personal life.
And remember, every action you take, every decision you make, it can ripple outward. Think strategically, be adaptable, and never stop learning and growing.
And hey, most importantly, don't be afraid to compete, but compete the right way. Stick to your values, stay true to yourself, and use your influence to make the world a better place.
Couldn't said it better myself.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged.